We're going to be covering the best settings for Call of Duty Warzone. It's going to have everything all in one video, from graphics, controller, mouse and keyboard, audio, and a video control panel, and more. So let's jump right in. Starting with graphics and on the display tab. Now for the display mode, full screen is actually the best in terms of performance. However, I'm on a multiple monitor setup and I like to go between monitors, so I play on borderless, but full screen is better. For your monitor, make sure this is set on whatever monitor you normally play with. Your adapter is going to be your GPU. For screen refresh rate, make sure this is on the highest possible setting for your monitor. And we will also check here in a little bit, and then a video control panel, how to verify this is on the right setting. Render resolution, just leave this on 100. I do not recommend going over 100. It's only going to hurt your performance. If you're on a low end PC though, you could turn this down a little bit, maybe like 75, 80%, something like that. Dynamic resolution, also turn this off unless you're on a very low end PC. You could turn this on and kind of hit a rough frame limit of what you want to aim for, but your game is going to run and not look nearly as good if you do that. Aspect ratio, going to leave on automatic. VSync, turn off unless you're having very bad screen tearing. If so, you can turn that on, but just know you will get a little bit of input delay or input lag with that on. For custom frame rate limit, I recommend for the gameplay just turning that all the way up to the maximum, but for your menu and out of focus, turning this down some, because it gives your PC a bit of a chance to rest, especially when you're not in game. Brightness is going to be personal preference. You can kind of set this here to get it where this is barely visible and whatnot. However, I do tweak my brightness later in my Nvidia control panel and my monitor settings. For the gamma, you're going to be on 2.2 if you're on a monitor, 2.4 if you're on a TV. Highlights, I recommend turning off, as this can hurt your performance quite a bit unless you need to use Nvidia highlights for replays and things like that. For Nvidia Reflex low latency, just leave this on enabled. There's some other people that are way smarter than me, way more into this technology stuff, that they found that there's just enabled and then leaving it on the low latency mode in the control panel on is actually the best combination for the setting for this. Moving over to the quality tab of graphics for field of view, this is personal preference, but I do recommend playing on the maximum of 120. It's going to give you the best possible kind of performance and best advantages in the game. And then for advanced, we do play on affected, and I also highly recommend this setting over independent. I do have a dedicated video on this that I can link in the description if you're interested though. For camera movement, definitely want to go with least. That way your screen is not shaking, makes the game a lot easier to play on if it's on least. For streaming quality, gonna leave this on normal. Unless you're on a very low end PC, you could turn this down. Texture resolution, there's actually not much of a performance difference from very low to normal, so I play with normal because the game looks way better. But if you're on a low-end PC, you don't have a lot of VRAM here, you might need to turn that down. For the texture filter, Inceotropic, gonna leave that on low. Particle quality, we actually leave on high. Actually makes the game look much better and actually can help performance in certain situations. Bullet impacts and sprays, I leave enabled. This doesn't have much to do with FPS. So for tessellation, gonna leave that off. Dismemberment and gore effects is up to you. It can slightly improve FPS at certain times if it's disabled, but I like to leave it on because, hey, it looks cool. On-demand texture trimming, we're gonna leave that off. This can cause a lot of extra workload on your PC when it's constantly trying to download these textures. Going down to post-processing effects. So for filmic strength, we're gonna want this on 1 if our anti-aliasing is not set to the top 2 settings. For the best performance, leaving it off is gonna be your best bet. However, it does make some things look jagged. Edges look jagged and trees can look sort of weird as well. So if you want the game to look a little bit better, but at the cost of a little bit of FPS, go with just SMA 1 times. But both of these settings, you're gonna keep filmic strength on 1. Filmic grain, I recommend leaving off. It just makes the game look bad. DLSS, even if you have a 1440p monitor, I do not recommend using. It makes the game look super blurry and it doesn't help performance all that much either, so turn that off. Depth of field and both blurs, I highly recommend keeping disabled. For shadow and lighting, for the shadow map resolution, definitely want to keep this on low as this can hurt your FPS, but we do leave both the cache spot shadows and cache sun shadows as enabled. And then we're going to keep particle lighting as low, and our last 3 settings here will all be disabled as well. And then when you're done, don't forget to hit apply settings. Now, before we move on, I do want to cover the Nvidia control panel, as this does tie in heavily with our graphic settings. If you have an AMD card though, you can feel free to skip this part. So to get here, you're going to right click on your display on your monitor and you're going to click on the control panel. When you first pop up, it should come on this screen here, and you're going to want to make sure you have use the advanced 3D image settings checked. Then go down to manage 3D settings, and I'm just going to scroll through these very slowly. Feel free to pause, go back and just copy these down basically. I'm not gonna go in and explain every single one in detail because I'll be honest, I only have a very vague understanding of a lot of these settings. So I'll just keep going here nice and slow. And then when you're done, don't forget to hit apply before moving on. Now let's go over to change resolution, and this is where we're gonna make sure that you're on the correct refresh rate. If it's not giving you an option to go to your highest refresh rate for your monitor, make sure you are not on this Ultra HD part, and make sure you go down to the part that just says PC and then selecting the resolution of your monitor. Scroll down here to the bottom here, and for the output color depth, most of you guys are probably on 8, but if you're on a higher end monitor, you might have the option to go with 10, which is just a little bit better for the colors. And then make sure the output dynamic range is set to full and not limited. And then again, hit apply before we move on. Then we're gonna go down to the adjust desktop color settings. So I do not use Nvidia filters. I highly recommend against using them because it hurts your FPS, can cause input delay. But through this right here is how we make the game look way better and make it look like we have filters without any cost or performance. A lot of this is personal preference, and it does come down to what kind of monitor you have as well, but I do recommend turning your brightness up anywhere between 55 and 65, and also with your contrast anywhere between 55 and 65. Also with the gamma, I recommend turning this up some as well from 1. I've been on 1.17 for a while. I see some people go as high as 1.25. It is all preference at the end of the day, but these are my personal settings. And then for digital vibrance, I recommend going up anywhere between like 70 to 80. I'm at 75, and this is gonna make your colors look way more vibrant and just make the game look so much more colorful like you have those filters on. Next, we're gonna go to adjust desktop size and position, and make sure we're on your monitor, and just make sure this is set to no scaling, and that for our resolution and our refresh rate are correct here as well. And then lastly, we're gonna go to the adjust video color settings and make sure this is on with Nvidia settings, go to advanced and make sure this is set to full and not limited. And then again, before we're completely done here, make sure you're hitting apply. Now, one other thing I want to talk about that I can't really show you guys because my screen recording doesn't capture this is my monitor settings. So I'm on a Samsung G7 Odyssey. It's a 240 Hertz 1440p monitor. Really happy with this monitor. But in the monitor settings, I have my brightness, contrast, and sharpness turned up a good bit. And I think that helps a lot, but this is completely dependent on your own monitor. So for me, I have my brightness and sharpness up to 80 and my contrast at 60. But again, this is totally on your monitor. Just don't forget to mess around with those settings and see what makes the game look better for you. Next, I'm gonna really quickly go through my interface settings. I do play on the colorblind type of Deuteranopia. I think it makes the game look a little bit brighter, a little bit more colorful. I do have my horizontal HUDs turned in a little bit. That just means my minimap and things like that are brought in closer to the screen. That way I'm not having to look quite as far up to the corner to see things like that. Make sure your minimap shape is on square. This gives you a little bit extra kind of real estate for seeing things on the minimap. As far as everything else goes, I'll let you guys, just look at this and feel free to pause, but none of this stuff is going to be super duper important when it comes to performance or things like that. Moving on to audio, I do have a dedicated video with audio where I go way more in depth, but I'll quickly show things here. For my audio mix, I go with boost low. I find this the best for hearing footsteps, especially when there's other noises going on, but Warzone audio in general is a little bit rough at times. I have my master volume turned down some. Music is all the way 0. That way I don't have to hear it and I can always hear everything in game. Dialogue volume is turned down, but I don't recommend going all the way off. That way you can still hear things like UAV overhead, enemy landing, things like that. Make sure your effects volume is all the way up to 100 because this is where things like footsteps come in. Cinematics, it's up to you. I've left that on though. Hit marker sound, I just have it set on the classic. I do not recommend going with mono audio. And then just scrolling through the rest of these, none of these are as important. I do have my voice chat volume turned down quite a bit though, but that's just because of my personal setup. For most people, you're probably going to want to leave this closer to 100 though. Now, I'm not going to cover this in this video, but in my audio video, I use another program called SoundLock. And basically what that does is it's a external program that it caps my volume from getting too loud. And it allows me to turn my overall game volume up, but I don't break my ears when really loud noises come in. So I'll leave a link to the description for that for more info on that. So let's now cover my controller settings. I do have a way more in-depth video where I explain a lot of these settings in my aim guide. So I'll link that in the video description as well. But some of my settings have changed just slightly, so I want to cover those here. So for my button and stick layouts, I do play on the default. However, I'm playing with a custom controller that has paddles. So the controller I've been playing with is my Hex gaming controller, and then I also play with a PS5 Reflex Scuff. I love both of these controllers. I am happy to play on either. I don't really have a preference, just lately I've been playing on the Hex one. Both of these have 4 paddles on the back, and the way I have these set is my far left is jump or X, far right is slide or circle, middle left is square or reload, and middle right is triangle, which is plate or switching weapons. And basically the big pro of this is that I can do all of these things with never having to take my thumb off the analog stick. I'm not a fan of playing claw. I just can't do it. But you know, claw is another option for a lot of people as well. Another thing you'll notice with the controller is I do play with slightly longer analog sticks. And also I play with a Galaxy Control Freak. This is just the low short one on my right analog stick only. Now, if you can't afford a custom controller and you can't get used to playing claw, one thing I do recommend if you're on just a standard regular controller is playing on Bumper Jumper Tactical. The reason for that is it allows you to slide cancel, jump, things like that with never having to take your thumb off the analog stick, and it's gonna help your movement a lot. Moving down to dead zone, this is going to depend on the controller. Overall, you want this as low as you can go without having stick drift. So if you are not touching your controller, but your character is still looking slightly to one direction, you need to turn your right minimum input dead zone up until that drifting is going to stop. For myself, I've been on 0.03 and I don't have any stick drift on either of my controllers. For the max input dead zone, you're gonna wanna keep this as high as it can go. For sensitivity, this comes down to preference. I play on 8.8. Just know that there are people that play 6.6, there are people that play 20.20, and they're all phenomenal. It's all at the end of the day, whatever you're comfortable with. For console players, because of that 80 FOV, you actually will move a little bit slower. So sometimes for console players, it might make sense for you guys to play at a slightly higher sensitivity than a PC player. But again, it's personal preference. Do what feels comfortable to you. I explained this and go more in depth with this in my aim guide video. For the ADS sensitivity multiplier, I do play at 0.85, and I do not play with a custom sensitivity per zoom, so all of my guns have the same ADS sense. This just helps me be more accurate at range by having a little bit lower value. For the aim response curve type, I play on dynamic. This is what the majority of the pros and kind of higher end players are playing on. This is something I go more in depth in with my aim guide video if you want more information. Aim assist, just gonna leave this on standard. If you're a PC player, you can turn your scale aim assist with FOV disabled. What this does is it's going to give you actually a wider bubble for your aim assist. However, putting enabled actually makes that bubble smaller, but feel a little bit stronger. I've played with both. Overall, I think disabled is the better option. Moving down just to cover a few of my other settings, some important ones here. The use reload behavior I recommend as contextual. This makes looting a lot easier, but you do have to hold reload and hold to put on plates. For the armor plate behavior, I recommend going with apply all. Just makes putting plates on way easier. That way you don't have to keep hitting it. Slide behavior as tap is going to help your side cancels and make them much easier. I am a huge fan of playing with automatic tactical sprint as on, as it just makes your movement way easier, not having to deal with sprint. And also with that will make your controller last longer because you're not constantly jamming on L3. And then lastly, for parachute auto deploy, I recommend turning that off for the most part, just because you can get lower to the ground if you don't have that on. Now I'm going to cover my mouse and keyboard settings. Some of you may not know, but I actually have played mostly mouse and keyboard, and I've only been on controller for a few months. So I still play mouse and keyboard, but just not as much lately because I've been enjoying controller more. So I play with the Logitech G Pro X Superlight, and I play with a DPI of 1600 and a mouse sensitivity of 2.0. I also have a video where I go way in depth about finding your sensitivity and comparing it to some of the best players in the game. So I'll link that video in the description, but I've been on this sense for a while. I'm a big fan of it. As you can see, I do have a lot of room on my desk for my mouse pad. This is the Lethal Gaming Venus mouse pad. It is a speed pad, and I have plenty of room. I can go basically, you know, as much as I want without having to worry about running out of room. So sometimes your sensitivity can depend on your setup. For the ADS mouse sensitivity mode, I recommend going with relative. Again, this is something I cover in depth in my other video. But this is gonna feel the most natural of keeping your sense the same when you aim your gun. I do not play with an ADS sensitivity multiplier. I don't think it's good for muscle memory because mouse and keyboard is very reliant on muscle memory. So I keep this on 1. Same with my custom sense per zoom, I leave that off. I don't play with anything inverted, and I do not play with any acceleration, filtering, any of that, because again, I don't think it's very good for muscle memory. Moving on to movement for slide behavior, I recommend keeping this as tap. I do turn off the mantle, although sometimes you still run into that issue. For automatic sprint, I do play with auto tac sprint as well. I'm a big fan of this. I think it makes movement much easier. I also have my parachute auto deploy as off. That way I can get lower to the ground. Now, one thing I'm going to say about my keybinds is they are a little bit unorthodox, but there's a reason for them, and I think it's very optimal once you get used to them. So standard WASD, I use X to pick up or interact things. I know that's very weird, but the reason for that is because I put E as prone, and it makes it very easy for me to hit drop shots and things like that, just because E is so easy for me to reach. Crouch I use as left shift. That's just personal preference. I know a lot of people like C as well. When it comes to sprint, I still have this button bound, and I have this as my side button on my mouse, but I'm really just use this for to steady aim or hold my breath when I'm sniping. I'm just going to quickly scroll through my weapons and equipment settings here. For the most part, I think all this you guys should leave the same. I do have the apply plate behavior as apply all though. Standard for fire and ADS. Now this is a very weird one. I play with caps lock as my reload. The reason for this is I use R to switch weapons because I find it much easier than using the scroll wheel or to use like any of the numbers up top. This is just a habit thing. I know a lot of people don't like this. It's an old habit I have from playing Fortnite. So, you know, if you want to keep it as R, totally fine, and just depends on what you're comfortable with for using as the next weapon. I use Z to mount. My melee is F. I actually have 2 buttons bound for my lethal because of throwing knives. I use C when I'm hitting throwing knives because I found that when I would reach to my mouse button, I would sometimes like miss and kind of like it would mess up my aim. But I like to have this one here if I'm throwing a grenade. That way I can hold that button, but I can still move around and still have access to hitting WASD without having to worry about it if I'm like trying to throw a grenade or something like that. For my tactical equipment, this would be like a stim or a heartbeat is going to be pressing my scroll wheel. I use 3 as armor plate instead of 4, just a little bit easier to reach. And then everything else here is pretty standard. As far as kill streaks and vehicles go, I have pretty much all of these default. However, one thing that I do use that is a little bit different is for helicopters specifically. I use space as ascend, and then I use descend as the side button on the mouse. The reason for this is it's actually way easier to fly because you have full control of hitting WASD, and then you can go up and down. And because as the default binds, it doesn't allow you to hit WASD and go up and down at the same time. So that's why I do that. For my overlays and shortcuts, I use V as map. I know that's weird. It's just way easier for me to reach than hitting M. I use Q as ping, which I think is like super underrated because I can very easily hit Q while I'm aiming and shooting at someone and get a live ping on them. So I'm a big fan of that. That's definitely a big advantage for when I'm on mouse and keyboard versus controller is I can ping very, very easily. And then moving on lastly to menu and navigation, I don't think I've really messed with any of these settings either. So guys, that is going to cover all of my settings. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Again, I'm going to link all those videos where I go more in depth on some of these topics like finding your sensitivity and things like that in the description below. As always, have a fabulous rest of your day. See you in the next one.